Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. I'm going to mute my laptop there. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. Tonight I am going on an adventure as we plunge with reckless abandon, and I swear, not even one handkerchief, into the 2012 movie adaptation of the first 6 chapters, there or thereabouts, of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, titled in this instance, An Unexpected Journey. Hello to Hugh. Hello to Brian. Thank you so much for joining me here live tonight. Before we get into it, a quick bit of business. The first and most obvious thing being, of course, that if you are watching me live, well, no, you're not. Because, for reasons which will become clear in just a moment, I've had a tough couple of weeks, and right now the single solitary cable that I need in order to make my camera setup here in the Next Word studio work is in the trunk of my car, which is on the other side of town, currently being tended by some very fine, or so I am assured, mechanics. So no footage of me tonight. I do have my regular slides in the video broadcast. If you're listening to this as a podcast after the fact, it doesn't really change your experience that much. Following on the heels of that explanation, then, an explanation for this an unexpected hiatus, I suppose, is what happened here through the month of January. January has just been a tough time for myself and for my family. Our youngest son broke his arm very badly early in the month, so we have been dealing with that, and there's been a week-long snowstorm which has kept us basically housebound. My car, as previously mentioned, is still in service and has been for, I think, coming on like a full week and a half now. So it's been a difficult time, which has led to this unexpected interruption, which will be followed by, I have to admit, a kind of irregular hiatus because of some changing family circumstances, because of some changing domestic circumstances, and, you know, the economic landscape that we are all facing here in 2026. I am taking on another full-time job, which means that my podcast production schedule will be slowed over the course of the next several months. What that means in practice is that Tuesday nights are still going to be a broadcast night for me from this point going forward, but we're going to be alternating episodes of Shire Reckoning with episodes of my genre fiction podcast, Stars and Swords. So tonight we're going to be discussing An Unexpected Journey. Next week I'm going to be pivoting back to discuss For Stars and Swords, the back half, I guess, of William Gibson's formative cyberpunk novel Neuromancer. Then the following week we'll be back in Middle-earth for for our conversation regarding the desolation of Smaug. Good Lord, can you tell? It has been a month since last I podcasted. So that schedule will be available over on the Patreon page. I'm going to try and sketch that out in advance. And I know that some of us were a little wearied at the thought of launching into another adventure in close reading, particularly because we were talking about studying perhaps a text like Beren and Luthien, which is probably still on the horizon. But we're going to take this brief pause to slow our pace a little, though I do expect these individual episodes to be somewhat longer than the episodes which preceded them. So, with all of that said, with the preamble out of the way, and with my firm and sincere thanks for your patience and indulgence, let's get into our discussion of An Unexpected Journey. Perhaps surprisingly, given my history in podcasting about Tolkien, this is the first time that I have talked with any kind of real intentionality or forethought about the Peter Jackson adaptations. And it seems weird to begin here with film 4 in what is eventually a 6-film arc. I will asterisk that to say long-term listeners may know how unwilling I am to accept a timeline dependent on prequels and the like, because films are fashioned like all art is fashioned in phenomenological time, and An Unexpected Journey is no more a starting point for the Jackson adaptations of Tolkien's work than is The Phantom Menace, or The Magician's Nephew, or Wicked for Good, or even Oz the Great and Powerful, if anyone remembers that film from, probably around 2012, now that I think of it, probably sometime around there at least. So we're not going to be looking at this as a text unto itself. We're not going to be looking at this as a starting point for Jackson's interpretation of Middle-earth for very striking and compelling reasons, which we will get to in just a little bit. But we are going to be looking at it as an adaptation of a book that we have now studied in great depth. We're going to be looking at what works in this film and what doesn't, what differs from Jackson's approach to The Lord of the Rings, though we're going to save much of our discussion of those films until we study them in more depth in the months to come. And I'm not going to list, point by point, all the things that don't work in this movie. We have, a whole internet for that. I will probably pull out a few of my least favorite things in the spirit of personal response, but overall, I really do want to settle this discussion as an exploration of adaptation, the challenges and opportunities of adaptation, the incredible and specific challenges which were laid at the feet of Peter Jackson et al. And I want to measure its success or its failures in terms of its own ambition, but certainly in terms of its own intent, which I suppose leads us to the first major point of clarification, because throughout this discussion, I'm going to be referring to this movie as fundamentally belonging to Peter Jackson. We have, after all, an auteurist approach to cinema. He gets the most prominent credit in the credit block, and I am going to use that somewhat lazy synecdoche by which Peter Jackson refers to, on the one hand, the senior production team of Jackson and Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens, and on the other hand, the entire film production crew. I will note here that cinema is enormously collaborative, more so than any other creative industry. No director, not Jackson, not Scorsese, not Tarantino, not even James Cameron, creates their art without compromise. It is a mistake that we not only tumble into over and over, but seem to deify, seem to revere. It is a mistake to think that directors are responsible for every success and failure of their films. They are produced, again, in phenomenological time. They are produced in the midst and the mire of adversity. They are produced as a series of compromises which can have unintended consequences. That is particularly true for this film. It is a particularly vexed kind of production because Jackson comes in surprisingly late. Let's take a look at our first slide of the evening, just a very avuncular Peter Jackson. So one interesting thing to note here is that Jackson and his wife Fran Walsh first had the idea of adapting Tolkien's work all the way back in 1995. Their original pitch was a movie trilogy wherein the first film would be The Hobbit and the second and the third would cover The Lord of the Rings. This project actually gets some momentum behind it, but then stalls out because Solzantz and the United Artists still hold the rights for The Hobbit. So instead, the production pivots to The Lord of the Rings. The stage is set for the deal with New Line Cinema and the production of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Return of the King is released all the way in 2003. It sweeps the Oscars the following year. Jackson moves on to other things, including King Kong in 2005, The Lovely Bones in 2009, both of which are very bad films in very different ways. What is important to this story, though, in the aftermath of the incredible success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, is that there is real friction between Jackson and New Line. He sues them in 2005, just 2 years after the release of The Return of the King, claiming that New Line has withheld money from him and requesting a legal audit of their accounts. This is working its way through the court system when in early 2006, New Line, apropos of nothing apparently, announces an interest in producing Hobbit movies with Jackson attached. This is perfectly straightforward, except that the lawsuit becomes acrimonious. Public claims, rather unpleasant public claims, are made about the quality of Jackson's character, and the whole thing falls apart. By December of 2007, though, a plan is in place which ostensibly publicly satisfies both parties. The Hobbit will be adapted into 2 films released in 2011 and 2012, and Jackson, though not directing, will executively produce. And there's a ton of ink spilled in the press at that time about Jackson not wanting to compete with his prior films, about finding a bold new direction for Middle-earth, about The Hobbit being a very different kind of story from The Lord of the Rings. And this is happening, parenthetically, while the Tolkien estate is also very publicly suing New Line for breach of contract, claiming that the $62,500 paid to the Tolkien estate by New Line in return for the rights to The Lord of the Rings was insufficient, which honestly seems fair, looking back at the success of those films. This takes us to April of 2008, when Guillermo del Toro is tapped to direct. Del Toro is coming off of really a run of almost unprecedented success in the genre space in the early 2000s. In 2002, he directs Blade 2 for New Line. Blade 2 is a huge success and easily the best of that trilogy. 2004, he goes over to Sony and produces Hellboy. 2006, perhaps most famously, he directs Pan's Labyrinth for Warner Brothers. 2008, he has the follow-up Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, which, while less successful, still presents that inimitable Del Toro style. He has earned, by this point, a real reputation as being a visionary on screen. I think that he is occupying a space that had previously been ceded back through, the very late 1980s into the 1990s, a space that had previously been ceded to creators like Tim Burton, someone who can pivot their style to a certain extent, who can accommodate different texts and different tones. Of course, the next film that Del Toro actually directs will be Pacific Rim, which looks very different to the work that he has done before, but can also be readily identified. There is no mistaking a Del Toro film in 2006, 2008, 2010. So let's take a look at the timeline of production for reasons which will, as I say, become very clear as we get into our discussion of the film proper. So in April of 2008, Del Toro signs to direct and immediately begins active development. He is working with Jackson and Walsh and Boyens. He is breaking the story. He is coming up with concept art. He is visualizing these action set pieces, what we call now previs, in order to give the CGI artists who are working day and night on this project a head start on the production. And this stuff, though it might seem ephemeral, is actually binding because of the production pipeline. There are elements of the design and the content of this film that are locked in 2008, even that early in the process. It takes them a year, essentially, from April 2008 to March 2009 to figure out what these films are going to be. Of course, then we're still talking about 2 Hobbit movies. Then, in March of 2009, with the overall structure kind of broken down, work begins on the scripts themselves. They, of course, take longer than expected. Work is continuing throughout this year on the practical and the digital effects, but MGM, who are working with New Line to fund the project, are getting nervous about how expensive everything is, how long it is taking. MGM is facing its own huge economic difficulties. At the time, of course, that is a difficult time economically for basically everyone. The movies are pushed back early in 2010, in January 2010. In fact, both movies are delayed by over a year. By May, Del Toro steps away from the project, citing his frustration with MGM's delays and the demands of his own schedule, though it seems certain from behind-the-scenes gossip, from industry gossip, that MGM had lost faith in Del Toro to deliver the billion-dollar blockbusters that they needed to survive. He was just too risky. What had looked provocative and avant-garde back in 2008 was now looking like a much less safe deal, and MGM wanted, ultimately, a safety play. They wanted to secure the kind of financial responses that they had got from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, or that they had seen New Line get from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? MGM needed to kind of batten down the hatches and maintain a certain economic viability in order to preserve their legacy, in order to continue to exist, in order to be Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer as they had always been. Parenthetically, MGM was bought lock, stock, and barrel by Amazon. So the movies have been pushed back. There is this gap now, and in the pivot, they hire Jackson back, whose work begins to make this brave new pair of films as close as possible to Jackson's Middle-earth saga as it's already been presented, with 9 months to run before principal photography begins. He comes in with unfinished scripts, unfinished storyboards, a ton of expensive production that has to stay in place and is not his vision, and frankly, a mountain to climb ahead of him. In a 2015 interview with the Independent newspaper in London, Jackson said, quote, "It was impossible, and as a result of it being impossible, I just started shooting the movie with most of it not prepped at all. You're going onto a set and you're winging it. You've got these massively complicated scenes, no storyboards, and you're making it up there and then on the spot." End quote. And I'm emphasizing this for 2 reasons, right? The first is to underscore how compressed Jackson's pre-production pipeline was, how little time he had to work, and how he had to inevitably develop off of the foundation built by Del Toro, off of character designs and set-piece architecture which may not have aligned with his own vision. And I am not saying here, even in the slightest, that Jackson is everything good about this film and Del Toro is everything bad about this film. I think that Del Toro has a very well-deserved reputation for being a truly unique filmmaker. I love Blade 2. I love the Hellboy movies. I even kind of like Pacific Rim, as dumb as that film is. It just makes sense that there are parts of this film, watching this film, it becomes evident that there are parts of this film that do not belong to the same production process, right? That belong to Del Toro, that perhaps could have been more effective in that version of the story. A version of the story that Philippa Boyens, long after the fact, described as being much more like a dark fairy tale, much more tonally distinct from the Peter Jackson version of the story that we now get. I'm thinking here particularly, to jump a little ahead, of the characterization of Azog the Defiler, particularly the original design of Azog. If you haven't seen what Azog looked like before he was the CGI model that we have in front of us, you should go and look that up, because I should have pulled a slide of it, honestly, because it's genuinely fascinating. And of course, even in this film, we can look at the depiction of the Battle of Azanobazar as being a very different, as it's presented in the film, the Battle of Moria, even though it takes place in the Valley of Azanobazar, as every good Tolkien reader knows. That feels very out of place, out of joint with the rest of the film and the rest of Middle-earth as we've been introduced to it previously. It is a different kind of sequence. But that's not the only thing that changes the terrain under the feet of the production team, because the period between the beginning of this particular production and the release of the first film, I guess I should just gloss this, right? It is June of 2010 when Jackson is hired to direct. It is March of 2011 when principal photography begins, and it is July of 2012 when principal photography ends and the third film is announced. This duology is now a trilogy, and there was much said on the internet about that decision at the time. I am glad to say that I think, publicly on record as being someone who never doubted the viability of a trilogy for The Hobbit. There's so much material there. In May of 2013, The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey, the film that we are discussing tonight, released in March of 2013. Then in May of that same year, we went back to New Zealand for 10 weeks of additional photography in order to fill in the gaps and allow the second two films to take shape. In April of 2014, we were gifted The Hobbit: The Desolation of Smaug in the US, and in March of 2015, the third film, The Hobbit: The Battle of the Five Armies. But huge things happen over this span of time between April of 2008, when Del Toro is initially contracted to begin development, and March 2015, when the final movie is released. This is one of the most transformative periods in the history of Hollywood, and it is tough for this film that they had to surf these particular waves. Let's take a quick look at some context here. I've gone back to 2001 for the release year of course, The Fellowship of the Ring. This is the global top 10 in movies for 2001. We begin with Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, Monsters, Inc., Shrek, Ocean's 11, Pearl Harbor, The Mummy Returns, Jurassic Park 3, Planet of the Apes, and Hannibal. It's amazing that Planet of the Apes is on that list. The aforementioned Tim Burton, of course, a truly, truly dreadful but fascinating film. Now, what's interesting about this list, obviously the top two places are taken by the big ticket fantasy adaptations of the year, the beginning of the Harry Potter franchise, the beginning of the Lord of the Rings franchise. These are going to be blockbuster juggernauts for years to come. And then we have two sequels hanging out much lower on the list. The very good, The Mummy Returns, and the very bad, Jurassic Park 3. So two new franchise starters, two established sequels, and then 6 original films. Now, of course, these films get sequels. We get an Ocean's 12. We eventually get a Monsters, Inc. 2. We get Shrek, 6 movies, 7 movies in that series now. But those films are, at least ostensibly, standalone films. Ocean's 11 isn't dependent on Ocean's 12 existing in order to kind of validate its existence. We're still making single-shot movies in 2001. So let's transition out to 2008, when Del Toro is hired and pre-production begins. 2008, of course, one of the most influential, notoriously influential years in modern cinema history. Probably the year from the 21st century which defines the shape of cinema here in 2026. Because the most successful film of 2008 is The Dark Knight. It makes $997 million worldwide, just shy of that billion-dollar number. Number 2 is Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Kung Fu Panda, Hancock, Mamma Mia, Madagascar, Escape to Africa, Quantum of Solace. At number 8, arguably the most influential film out of this entire year, a little film called Iron Man. Number 9 is Wall-E, and number 10 is The Chronicles of Narnia, Prince Caspian. So you can see here that in the 7 years between 2001 and 2008, we have become a little more reliant on franchise filmmaking, right? Iron Man is going to set a template that is going to be followed, but we're already kind of in that space. The Dark Knight is the second of Nolan's very successful Batman trilogy. We've returned to Indiana Jones after a break of years. This is the second the second Chronicles of Narnia movie, though that one, of course, doesn't go as well as some of the others. But this is where the template is set. And what I'm going to do now is fast forward just 4 years to 2012, the year that An Unexpected Journey was released. Because the landscape of film itself looks completely different. This is the global top 10 from 2012. At number 1, The Avengers. At number 2, Skyfall. Number 3, The Dark Knight Rises. Then The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. Not at all a commercial failure. Not if $1 billion counts as a commercial failure. Ice Age, Continental Drift. The Twilight Saga, Breaking Dawn Part 2. The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Madagascar 3. Europe's Most Wanted. The Hunger Games. And Men in Black 3. That's 2 films out of the top 10 that are intended to be franchise starters. The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, and The Hunger Games. The other 8 are leveraging existing IP. They are taking place in existing franchises. We have seen this retreat from original filmmaking to these safe harbors, these profitable safe houses where the movie industry can spend millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars because they are guaranteed of the return thanks to the power of the IP itself. This has only become worse in the 14 years since 2012, lest you fear that there's going to be a swing back in any other kind of direction. Though, you know, the recent Oscar nominations for this year are at least providing a small sliver of hope, and maybe that's all that we can take in 2026. So I mention all of this. I bring all of this up to establish with some rigor, I hope, that the ground has moved under this production as it is in its pre-production phase. After Del Toro is hired, where he's already in a delicate position, right? He's hired right before Iron Man comes out, which is 2 months before The Dark Knight comes out. So the entire industry pivots at that point, and Del Toro is folding that into his own production process. MGM is getting nervous. There is a global recession happening at this point. So the entire production strategy of this film, the raison d'etre of this film, pivots in that first year of production. And then Jackson is locked to those choices when he comes on board with 9 months before principal photography begins. And again, I don't bring all this up to excuse the flaws in the film or even explain the failures of the film, but just to situate it very specifically in a time and place. There is a sense in which The Hobbit is, I think, an unlovely object. It is cracked and it is flawed. It does not fit together. I think even fans and advocates for this trilogy would not say that it fits together in the way that The Lord of the Rings does. The Lord of the Rings, of course, particularly the Fellowship of the Ring, showing up on screen, what is that, 2 weeks after Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, this absolutely titanic resurgence in fantasy filmmaking right there in 2001. It's so interesting to see how obedient to the text, like the literal text, the first Harry Potter film has, and how inaccessible it is to anyone who does not already know that story. I've made this argument many, many times, that it fundamentally fails as an adaptation because it is completely impenetrable. It is absolutely opaque. It not only conveys none of the plot and little of the characterization of that first Harry Potter book, it doesn't allow for entry into the magic of that story in the way that the novel does. Whereas Jackson's Fellowship of the Ring is this effortless transition into Tolkien's secondary world. So that film juxtaposed against this film is going to give The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, a kind of unloveliness. But we must also acknowledge that as the movie industry is shifting, as the movie industry is transforming, we're looking at a text that is itself dependent on movement and transformation. We're looking at a text that doesn't exist in a single form as The Lord of the Rings, to the largest possible extent, does. The Hobbit is a text in conversation with itself, of course, even through its first and second editions. It is revised by Tolkien in the arc of its publication, and then is positioned alongside The Lord of the Rings and alongside the broader Silmarillion, the broader Legendarium, right? As an accompanying text, as an adjunct text. There's something about the way that Tolkien, I've described this before per John Ratliff as Tolkien's auto-plagiaristic impulse, right? That he loves to borrow from himself, to quote from himself, to pull from his own previous earlier work, which he absolutely does throughout The Hobbit. That's where Elrond comes from. It's where the swords come from. It's where the idea of the relationships between elves and dwarves comes from, right? We kind of recapitulate the tension around the Nauglamir in Beleriand between the elves of Thranduil's woodland realm and the dwarves of Erebor. That's certainly one way of reading that interaction there. He pulls these proper nouns out of his own mythology. What there is not even a literary effort primarily, right? It is his intent to build a mythology for England, and that is pretty much how those proper nouns are being used as he folds them into The Hobbit. It's exactly the same way, I had this thought the other day, that it is exactly the same way as Lewis folding Father Christmas into The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? Lewis just taps this aspect of popular culture, of English mythology, and pulls it into his fantasy world in order to create some internal validity, if you like, and some internal texture too. Tolkien is doing exactly the same thing when he is using Elrond and when he is using stories of Gondolin, but he's of course responsible for both parts of that creation, and because he's responsible for both parts of that creation, because he has a power over it, he then has to embark on this lifelong process of integration and reintegration. He, as we've discussed before, as we move through The Hobbit, we were talking about his fifth phase, revisions in 1960, talking about the work he was doing to fit The Hobbit better into the world of The Lord of the Rings, which is, of course, the challenge that is right here in front of Jackson, even before he is hired in the wake of Del Toro and presumably given a firm instruction to make this one just like the other ones. We really need the money. So there's a lot of interaction. I'm fascinated by the ways in which this film operates as its own intertext. We're going to talk a little more about that as we move forward. We should acknowledge, though, the largest challenge in the adaptive process for The Hobbit isn't Bilbo or Gandalf or Elrond or the swords. The trolls, right? We talk about the trolls. That's a little tricky. The eagles and the dependence of the eagles is a literal deus ex machina, right? We're seeing some similarities here between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings that we have to navigate in terms of the adaptation. But the most obvious challenge awaiting any adaptation of The Hobbit is the sheer number of dwarves. Let's take a look here at our cast from one of the promotional posters of The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey. You can see, if you're joining me live, if you're looking at the slides after the fact, you can see here the dwarven cast. The top row, Gloin, Keely, Bofur, and Bifur. We've got Owen and Ori and Balin there on the second row. Thorin, of course, in the middle, flanked to the bottom left and the bottom right by Fili and Dwalin, respectively. Bomber in the middle beneath Thorin, with Dori and Nori right there at the bottom. And the challenge here, of course, is that this is too many dwarves. Tolkien understood this was too many dwarves. Tolkien struggled with this through the writing of The Hobbit in the first place and ultimately through the revision of The Hobbit 2. Originally, he tried to do what the filmmakers have tried to do, which is give every dwarf a little bit of screen time. Give every dwarf a little bit of personality, a couple lines of dialogue, just have them have a reason for being there, which the filmmakers, Jackson et al., have continued. That is an inspiration that they have taken and run with, to the extent that they have collapsed most of these dwarves down to a single characteristic, right? We have Gloin there in the top left as played by Peter Hambleton. Basically no character in the film as it shows up, but he is carrying a familiar prop, so that's probably enough. I should note here, actually, that Peter Hambleton, who plays Gloin, and gosh, who else is it? It's William Kersher, who plays Bifur, and oh my gosh, I've forgotten who the other one is. Dory, Mark Hadlow. Yes, that's right. I've got to look here at their faces right here on the poster in front of me to remember who they are. Mark Hadlow, who plays Dory, William Kircher, who plays Bifur, and Peter Hambleton, who play Gloin, also provided the motion capture for the trolls, for Tom and William and Bert, that we will meet in the course of this film, which I'll have a few things to say about when we get there. So Gloin has essentially, as I say, no character, but he has the axe, and that's maybe enough. Keely is notably hot, right? H-A-W-T. Bofur, played by the wonderful James Nesbitt, is charming and whimsical and grounded in a way that bespeaks a kind of wisdom that I find very interesting, interesting even more than I find charming. But, you know, here he's standing next to Bifur, who is defined as being the dwarf who has an axe in his head and therefore cannot speak Westron, so has to speak Chuzdul, and therefore basically does not speak through the course of the entire film. Apparently, I have not seen this validated, but I have seen this reported in several different places. Apparently, the reason for this axe in the head is that it was wordplay on the part of Del Toro, who saw Bifur's name as being a short form of the word bifurcated, which I honestly do not think is Tolkien's intent, but, you know, we've got to make everyone distinct in their own way, so that's how we'll make him stand out. Similarly, Owen is deaf, and Ori is young and impetuous, and Balin is the best, right? And Balin is one of the few dwarves who manages to escape this reduction in their complexity as characters. Balin, played by the wonderful Ken Stott, is the wise advisor to Thorin. He and his brother Dwalin, played by the excellent Graham McTavish, embody the two sides of the king, right? They are the pen and the sword of the king. Balin is the diplomat and Dwalin is the warrior. He is the soldier. He is the king's military power. And they work brilliantly, I think, in concert, according to that definition. We also have Fili here, played by Dean O'Gorman, who is also hot, but not as hot as Keely. A last-minute replacement there, but I think generally lovely, if somewhat inessential. I think he gives a fine performance. We have Bomber, as played by Stephen Hunter, who is comedically fat, drawing on the text, but making it somehow even more reductive than it was in the original. We have Dory, as I say, played by Mark Hadlow, who is comically effete and fastidious in a way that comes across as queerphobic in the strangest way. I'm not at all a fan of that performance, despite actually quite liking Mark Hadlow's other work a lot. And then we have Nori, as played by Jed Brophy, who has braided eyebrows. There is some informed storytelling about him being the rogue of the party, right? We get a couple of moments where he is stealing various things from Rivendell, but the whole idea of him being the rogue of the party is invalidated because A, no he isn't, and B, doesn't that somewhat obfuscate and obviate the need for Bilbo in the first place? Here's the thing. The challenge to producing this story is always going to lie in your treatment of the dwarves. We can commit to this comic troupe. We can commit to this squad under the command of Thorin, right? We can militarize them. We can make them more capable in combat, which is certainly a thing that we intermittently do in the long running time of An Unexpected Journey. That's certainly one of the ways in which we make this more of a contemporary fantasy film circa 2012 is to juice the action sequences to make everyone kind of a low level superhero, or in some cases, a high level superhero. But the truth is, the challenge is that there are simply too many dwarves. There are too many dwarves in the book, and there are too many dwarves here. Tolkien effectively, on the page, consolidates them as he is writing and revising The Hobbit. He is cutting down the number of different speaking parts that there are. He is pulling these lines together to give more characterization to Balin and to Dwalin to a certain extent, to Thorin certainly, right? He understands that spreading this jam... I don't know why I would say jam when I have a perfectly good Tolkienian metaphor of butter, right? Spreading this butter over too much bread is not going to serve anyone, so he focuses his efforts. Unfortunately, the film does not really. We seem intent on giving each of these characters their own moment in the spotlight, or moments in the spotlight, their own defining characteristics, even though, if you'll permit me to skip to the next slide, we can effortlessly cut almost all of them. We can lose Gloin. We can lose Bifur. We can lose Owen and Ori. We can lose Fili, but if you really want to keep him, then fine, I'm not terribly invested in him. We can absolutely lose Bomber. We can lose Dory, and we can lose Nori, and that consolidates your core cast down to a very accessible and manageable 5. Thorin, Balin, Dwalin, Keely, and Bofur, which conveniently covers, in the broadest sense, all of the kinds of dwarf that the film gives us. We get the king, we get his advisors, we get his common man jester, right? Bofur here can absolutely fulfill all of our comedic requirements as we move forward. And of course, the king's hot nephew. I believe it's commedia dell'arte that gives us the archetype of the king's hot nephew. And I say that this is a possible approach here because the focus on the story, the focus of the viewer, largely, is on Thorin Oakenshield. Reimagined here as something of an Anglo-Saxon hero. His positioning in terms of the film as we see it is really fascinating. He is is a priori, right? From the very first, he is fundamentally dedicated to the reclamation and the reconstruction of his home. This is the change that is made to his arc. This story doesn't begin as a treasure hunt and transform into something else as we move forward. This is a tale of vengeance. This is a tale defined by vengeance. We have the vengeance of Thorin and the dwarves of Erebor against Smaug, the chief and greatest calamity of his age, and we have the whole storyline with Azog the Defiler too, about whom we will have more to say in a moment. And this situates Thorin absolutely at the heart of the narrative as it is presented. The quest is his, the stakes are his, the emotional arc is his, the moral arc is his. He's right there at the heart of the story, though the film doesn't want to commit too much to that. The film doesn't want to commit to, for example, Thorin's POV. We want to keep him just a little distant. We want to keep him off to one side, which is unusual because there was some criticism of the introduction of a superfluous but broadly justified and engaging arc for Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings trilogy back in the very early 2000s. That whole, I don't want to be king, I don't know that I'm worth it, I don't know that it's really what I want to do. Oh, it turns out I am the king because I am the king. This kind of tautological transformation that he undergoes in the third film is really interesting. It's a really fascinating kind of move in its absence, right? The character arc of Aragorn, such as it is, I think can be studied at enormous length. I think we could easily spend a couple of hours just going beat by beat through the story of Aragorn in those films as a character who is obedient to the demands of a conventional hero's journey character arc, but doesn't actually take the necessary steps. Like, doesn't actually become transformed because he already is the thing that he is eventually going to be. So there's some pushback against the inclusion of that plot. But what you can't say about that is that we hear about it at one remove. Aragorn is there, like basically from the beginning. Certainly by the time that we get to Rivendell, right? Aragorn by the time he is revealed to be Aragorn, in fact, he's just there. Then by the time we get to the Two Towers after the splitting of the Fellowship, we see Aragorn as much as a POV protagonist, right? As any other character in that series. He is holding together fully half of that story in the Two Towers. Thorin, though, is not. He is held at such an arm's length that he literally walks away from the camp in the second large chunk of this film. He walks away from the camp and stands heroically looking out to the middle distance while Balin tells the story of how awesome he is. And we get the flashback to the Battle of Azanobazar, which is, great. There's a lot of really good, really mythic storytelling here. But I bring this up to highlight the ways in which Thorin in this film is not operating as a modern, contemporary fantasy hero. He is operating more like a man of myth, more like a man of legend, more like a Beowulf figure, right? He is operating like someone in a saga, and you're very conscious of the storytelling that is taking place around him. Consider the beginning of The Unexpected Party. Consider the arrival of the dwarves and the merriment and the chip the glasses and crack the plates song. More about that later. Not my favorite moment in the entire film, I have to say, but that's more a production issue than it is a conceptual issue. Conceptually, I quite like it. The actual production of it, the actual CGI of it in particular, does not work for me at all. But consider the merriment, right? Consider the conviviality and the exuberance of these dwarves, this merry comic troupe. And then Thorin arrives, and the tone drops into this register of the most grim epic you've ever heard in your life, right? It pivots on the presence of Thorin, even here too, as he walks away. He is the figure that we are looking at as we are hearing the story about how great he is. And I love how we're positioning him both at the heart of this story, but also absent from the heart of the story, also deliberately on the periphery of this story. The arc, as it goes, obviously we'll have more to say as we move through the trilogy as a whole over the next few weeks, but I do broadly... How much I like Thorin's arc depends on how close I am to the text. If I stand back from the trilogy and I just see like the beginning, the middle, the end, then I really like it, as of course we do from the book. It's a great arc, but there are moments where that arc really falters. There are moments in this film that I think I find very difficult to track his in the moment emotional stability. I find it very difficult to track in any given moment how he is feeling and how he is responding. But broadly, I think he works. As I say, we'll talk much more about his arc as we come into the next episode in this brief series. All we need to acknowledge for now is that, in a sense, he is defining the shape of the narrative. But the film isn't called Thorin Oakenshield, A Long Walk for Short Legs, despite what the structure might incline you to believe. Instead, we are rooted in the POV of our nominal protagonist, a humble hobbit of the Shire. Let's take a look at Martin Freeman as Chris joins us live. Hi, Chris. Good to have you with us this evening. There is no aspect of An Unexpected Journey which is universally loved. It is a battleground of differing opinions, right? The discourse has been charged from the moment of its release and remains weirdly charged even today, 14 years later. But while there is no aspect that is universally loved, I would think that I am in pretty safe territory when I say that Martin Freeman really works as Bilbo in this film. I think he gives a genuinely lovely performance. I think that he manages to give... There's a story that Peter Jackson tells. Of course, this is every actor of the right kind of age and look is auditioning for this role back in 2010, I believe, is when he's announced. Every single actor in the world is interested in doing it. But Peter Jackson says he only ever wanted Martin Freeman. He was watching episodes of the BBC Sherlock series on an iPad at 4 a.m., just desperate that Freeman would accept the offer to be in the film and that he would be good, right? And Jackson is not in any way saying, oh, once he signs the contract, this is a fait accompli. This is a done deal. Everything's going to work out great. He is also worried about the viability of the performance. But while Martin Freeman is very much giving Martin Freeman, while he is very much giving, his Sherlock performance, his The Office performance, if anyone remembers that far back to the British version of The Office, his, Marvel role is not at all dissimilar to the performance that he gives in this film. It is all the same. So naturalistic, so grounded, so human that I think it works despite and because of, right? We're getting a Baggins-Took duality here, both despite and because of the tone of the rest of the film and the tonal variation in the rest of the film. I think that as the rest of the film takes these wild swings, Martin Freeman's very naturalistic performance grounds us in a reality that is true for Bilbo, and a reality that remains kind of unperturbed. Now, it's true that we make simultaneously the Took-Baggins dichotomy at the heart of Bilbo Baggins, or the dichotomy is exactly the wrong word, I suppose, this dualism at the heart of Bilbo. We make it much more explicit in the film than we do in the book, though the film is clearly drawing from the book. It's not as though we're layering in something that isn't there, but we are saying it with our whole chest in the production of the film, though we're also not arcing it in such an interesting way or resolving it in its own complexity, quite the way that Tolkien does in the book. It's again, a really lovely performance. I want to kind of hold off on talking about his best moments. I think we have hit, for what it's worth, right here, very early, I think we have hit Martin Freeman's worst moment. And for all that I am hit, I am struck, I am moved by the emotional power of I'm going on an adventure, waving the contract, running through the, running down from Bag End and off on the road that goes ever on and on. I love that moment emotionally. I love it almost aesthetically. Do not like it as a moment of performance from Mr. Martin Freeman. It feels very out of step with what he does in the rest of the film. But that aside, I think he's genuinely lovely. And of course, I can't even talk about Martin Freeman in the context of Bilbo without also acknowledging the genuinely fantastic Ian Holm in the framing story. Just so lovely to see him again anyway, right? Just to be in his company in that role, I think is so lovely to see. We do get, the odd framing sequence. In fact, now might be the perfect time to talk a little about the structure of the story. Yeah, let's talk a little about the structure of the story and use that as an excuse to pivot into our discussion of our third major protagonist here in this film. So the film is 2 hours 40. The extended edition adds about another 13, 14 minutes, I believe it is. But the film, as is theatrically released, breaks into kind of 3 parts: the first hour, the second hour, and then the closing 40 minutes, most of which is the battle sequence for escaping Goblin Town and the out of the frying pan into the fire sequence there at the end of chapter 6. But we begin with this weird nested framing structure, because we don't even begin directly in Bag End. We begin with a 9-minute sequence. Hey, Frodo, did you know that Erebor was awesome? Also, the Arkenstone was awesome. Also, then things got much less awesome. We get the whole encapsulated story of the rise and fall of Erebor and Dale, too, parenthetically, in 9 minutes at the beginning of the film, which is a lot for a 2-hour, 40-minute film. And then, as though we weren't satisfied with one framing structure, we've had one framing structure, yes. What about second framing structure? We then have to go into a 4-minute sequence where we just remember the Lord of the Rings. And I'm not going to say that it doesn't work. I will absolutely admit that I am a sucker for it. When Frodo walks out into the corridor, I remember seeing that for the first time and just having my heart in my mouth. I just felt so shocked. I had managed to avoid almost all of the pre-release material for An Unexpected Journey. So I really did come into it quite fresh. I really was coming in with it without having seen, extended trailers or seeing the breakdowns on the internet that you would get in 2012. I managed to come into it quite fresh and did not know that Elijah Wood had taken up the big feat again of Frodo Baggins. But to see him there is just so lovely, for all that frame is broadly inessential. I do have a small nitpick, I guess, that we're supposed to believe that it is the day of his party. It is the day of the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. Frodo is going off to meet Gandalf, and Bilbo is now settling down to write the story of the Hobbit. He's sitting in a hole in the ground, there lived a Hobbit. He writes in the opening part of this movie. So anyway, that takes us 13 minutes into the film, and that is when we get the transition to Martin Freeman, and we get the beginning of the story. An excellent transition. I love it very much. Just a really pleasant and effortless transition. It feels very unforced for all that it is positively structural. And then we're introduced to perhaps the most unexpected part of this unexpected journey, which is its fidelity to the text that Tolkien presents to us. The fact that we get the whole good morning conversation between Gandalf and Bilbo there on the doorstep of Bag End, I just think is astonishing. I think it's so surprising. I could have put money down that we were going to get some epic scale introduction. The prologue, the Erebor prologue is in keeping with the kind of thing that I was expecting from this film prior to its release, but I did not expect so many of these quiet moments to be preserved. I didn't expect the good morning conversation, which I always find so endearing. I certainly didn't expect the bull roarer took and the head of Gulfimble flying 100 yards and going down a rabbit hole, and thus the battle was won and golf was invented. A great moment of levity in this story. It's a really respectful piece of adaptation in these very specific ways, which I just enjoy very much, obviously. That's going to fall away a little bit as we get into the second and third films. But here, at least, we're getting a lot of Tolkien's original dialogue. From there, as I say, we transition to Martin Freeman, we get the introduction of Gandalf, and then we get what we might think of as the unexpected party sequence, all the way up to Bilbo running out, announcing loudly he's going on an adventure. That is 27 minutes. That is basically a full half hour, and that is the foundation for this story. We get this, as I say, basically 15 minutes up front with our nested prologues, and then the unexpected party. Then we take a break in the proceedings to go and get more backstory and more plot happening off in the periphery, because that's when we pause to get the Azanul Bazaar backstory and to get the Radagast, the cutout to Radagast, about whom I will have more to say later, right? That takes us up to the Trolls. That's almost 20 minutes. And that's the first hour of the film. Gets us basically up to the horses being taken by the Trolls. And that's, interesting, except that our nominal protagonist here is center stage for barely half of the first hour. It's really only the unexpected party that has anything to do with Bilbo at all. And even while we're doing the unexpected party, we're also focusing in on Thorin. We're also focusing in on Gandalf. We're also introducing all of these other dwarves. Bilbo's very well established and very well grounded, but we're not getting a lot of time with him. The second hour then begins with the Trolls and the Troll Horde, which is about 15 minutes. You'll note the interesting transition here that we take the stonification of the Trolls away from Gandalf and give it to Bilbo instead, putting him a little more center into the story. But then we cut out to the introduction of Radagast and possibly, I'm going to say this speculatively, everyone's least favorite moment in this film, the bunny sled chase that lasts a full 10 minutes to carry us both to Rivendell and to the halfway point of the film. Then we're in Rivendell for 20 minutes with more from the White Council, filling in all of the gaps, filling in all of the plot. Beautiful stuff, don't get me wrong. I'm saying this kind of dismissively just because it's not really anchored in our sense of Bilbo's own protagonism, but not because it is in any way bad. We do really slow the Rivendell sequence down in the extended cut. I should say, I hesitate to ever say that I don't watch the extended cut, because I do, right? The truth of it is, I sat down this afternoon and having just watched it over the course of the last few days, I watched the damn extended cut again. I did, even though Unlike the Lord of the Rings movies, where I think the extended cut is inarguably the better cut in each case. I just think that those films are transformed by having a larger canvas. I do think there's an argument here that the extended cut is not as good. It's not as clear. We get 3 different comedic beats in Rivendell from the dwarves that really add nothing. But then on the other hand, we also get the very brief glimpse of young Bilbo Baggins back at the very beginning of the film bumping into Gandalf, which I find so endearing. Oh, and of course, the only on-screen appearance of the fabulous Belladonna Took, who is played rather brilliantly by Sonia Forbes Adam, an English actress who was, during the production of this film series, rather conveniently married to James Nesbitt, to Beaufort himself. They have been divorced for, gosh, I don't know, a decade at this point. Though it is worth noting that their daughters, Peggy and Mary, appear in the third film as Bard's daughters. So we'll look forward to them later in the series. All of that is to say that the Rivendell sequence I do find genuinely lovely. We will talk a little more about the White Council. Perhaps I will save my thoughts on the White Council until our next discussion to anchor that a little more in the Desolation of Smaug. But love what we get of Galadriel here. Love genuinely. I know that this is a little more contested, I think, in the fandom, in the discourse. I think that there are various positions on the Galadriel-Gandalf relationship. I have to say that I am firmly pro. I have to say that I think both actors perform it beautifully. I don't read it as being necessarily or plainly, flatly romantic. I do read it as being incredibly intimate. And I think that lends an enormous power to both, honestly. I think that it really genuinely works very well. But, your mileage may vary on that. I am told, at least, that mileage may vary. We then conclude our second hour, leaving Rivendell behind, and we have, in quick succession, the mountains and the storm and the capture and Goblin Town and our introduction to Gollum. That carries us to the 2-hour mark, at which point we accelerate quite markedly toward the end of the film. We do 10 minutes for Riddles in the Dark, then we do 10 minutes for the dwarves escaping from Goblin Town and Bilbo escaping from Gollum, separately but intertwined. Then we do 10 minutes of Out of the Frying Pan and Into the Fire with the trees and the fire and the pine cones and all of that, the moth famously. And then we conclude with the 12th kind of significant chunk of the film with the flight of the eagles to the Carrack and the long pull out to the Lonely Mountains that carries us all the way to our credits. And as I say, Bilbo is present for barely half of the first hour. He's active for only half of the second hour and really only takes center stage in parts, half roughly, of the third hour. It's really Riddles in the Dark and the new rewritten Out of the Frying Pan sequence that put him emotionally, if not physically, center stage. This is less Bilbo's story than the book would suggest, though, as noted, it's not quite Thorin's story either. If anything, the responsibility of the plot, the cause of all this trouble, can be placed at the well-worn boots of a certain wizard. Let's call up my next slide here. And this is, of course, one of the most conspicuous dynamics that we have to resolve if we are going to adapt The Hobbit in this way under these conditions. This is one of the most striking oppositional pairs that I was discussing earlier. The spirit of Gandalf as represented in The Hobbit and the spirit of Gandalf as represented in The Lord of the Rings, right? Gandalf, a wandering itinerant wizard, later Gandalf the Grey / Gandalf the White. And though what we get here from Sir Ian McKellen, I think, is as beautiful as anything, as nuanced, as funny, as light on his feet, not perhaps as intimately connected. There's a quality to... I will frame this out. I observed a quality to his performances, particularly during The Unexpected Party, that felt somewhat disconnected. I looked into this. I looked into how it was shot and how they had changed the very complicated process of first perspective that we saw back during the production of the Lord of the Rings films. And it turns out that they basically didn't use first perspective in this film at all. For The Unexpected Party, they had all of the dwarves in one set that was built to dwarf scale, and then they had Sir Ian McKellen sat on a completely different set that was built to Gandalf scale, and he had an earpiece and was functionally performing the scene at the same time as the dwarves were performing the scene in a completely different space by himself, which lends his performance, because the great power of Sir Ian, I think we can all agree, are those moments of intimacy, are those little twinkles in the eye, are those moments of unexpected warmth. The personability of the man is just incalculable. I find him such a magnetic actor, and I really always have. And to see him a little separated from the process as he's shooting those early scenes, I think was striking, and later scenes too. It was just perhaps the most immediately striking watching The Unexpected Party. But none of that detracts from either the arc of Gandalf as it's presented to us, or the positioning of Gandalf as a different kind of dude. Gandalf, because we are so familiar with The Lord of the Rings, and because we have to maintain a functional continuity, again, to emphasize something that Tolkien did not do. He did not get around to doing this. Because we have to acknowledge that this is the Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings, we have to change the nature of the conflicts that are besetting and bedeviling our heroes on their journey. It is insufficient for the Gandalf of The Lord of the Rings to simply drop out of the plot the way that Gandalf in The Hobbit drops out of the plot. We discussed it as we were moving through, as we arrived at the borders of Mirkwood, as we got to the trolls, in fact, in the first place. It's completely consistent with the medieval romance version of the itinerant wizard, that he will just wander off, that he is unreliable. He will be here and then he will be elsewhere, and he will offer no explanation for the absence, right? That is consistent with what those kinds of wizards and those kinds of stories can be expected to do. Gandalf, as we see him in The Lord of the Rings, cannot simply be allowed to vanish out of the story for 40 pages and then return as a Deus Ex Machina himself, right? It cannot return just to save the day. We have to justify and explore this, not least of all because an audience would be furious deprived of more Sir Ian McKellen, right? So we have to tighten the conflict surrounding Gandalf's direct appearance in and interference with motivation of Thorin's plot, Bilbo's plot, and also fill in what he is doing out on the side, which gives us, of course, the White Council plot, the Dol Guldur plot, which, as I say, we'll talk largely about next week, I think. But this is also one of the things that requires Azog, right? We have to have the idea of a more prominent threat. And I don't like Azog, the Defiler. I don't like him as a piece of character design. I don't like him as a character in his own right. There's almost nothing, in fact, about Azog. I don't love the performance, the motion capture performance, or the vocal performance. There's not a great deal there that I like. I'm not irritated that it's not, Bolg, right? The fact that it is Azog doesn't really bother me that much, but he doesn't really work for me. And I find the scale to which we have heightened these dramatic conflicts, whether it is the flight to Imladris, right? It's the bunny sled distraction method that Radagast employs so unconvincingly, or it's much more strikingly the out of the frying pan into the fire sequence at the end of the film. It doesn't hang together for me at all well, unfortunately. But I do understand the necessity of a greater foe. I do understand the necessity of a more present and active nemesis for Thorin directly and the company at large, particularly if you're going to take the established Lord of the Rings perspective on Middle-earth. That is to say, we're not going to get talking animals. We're not going to get the wargs having an opinion, even in their awful warg language, right? We're going to very much maintain the adult fantasy tone of the Lord of the Rings, even as we explore the storyline, the functional plot of The Hobbit. And that, I think, is ultimately the film's greatest challenge. It is tonally inconsistent. It is not completely tonally inconsistent. As I say, there are things that you can find that provide interesting dynamism, interesting internal tension, interesting friction within the course of the film. I like very much the way that the exuberance of the Unexpected Party is brought down, is grounded by Thorin. I love a lot of what we get from the Unexpected Party once Thorin shows up, despite being largely unmoved by what we get of the Unexpected Party before Thorin shows up. I think, as I said on a recent podcast, there are things within this film that... Chris is saying here, yes, I did mention this earlier, Chris, but you're absolutely right. Chris saw pictures of Azog when he was originally conceived as non-CGI, much better than CGI. Yes, I mean, I will take a dude in makeup over, a CGI creation any day, particularly in this film, right? it is a product of the shortened timeline that Peter Jackson is operating under that makes the CGI in this film look kind of shaky. We're going to see a marked improvement in the just visual fidelity of this film as we move into the second and third movies. There's going to be some terrible stuff in those films, but it is going to, I think, look better. And I would be reluctant to, well, I was about to say, I would be reluctant to describe the transition to split the duology into a trilogy as anything other than a time-saving mechanism. And of course, it's more than a time-saving mechanism. It's also a money-generating mechanism, which we love. But yeah, I think that part of the decision there was to allow the fine folks at Weta to spend more time on the set pieces that Jackson originally conceived rather than the set pieces that were started by Del Toro. I don't know what of Del Toro remains in this film. As I said earlier in the podcast, I am inclined to see the depiction of the Battle of Azanulbazar as being much more in the spirit of that dark fairy tale that Del Toro was promising. I would be surprised if the storm giants, if the stone giants, the Rock'em Sock'em Robot giants were not part of Del Toro's original vision, because that feels so much more dark fairy tale than it does Lord of the Rings fantasy, right? That doesn't feel like something that Jackson would have conceived. I think that he is too close to the ground of what is possible. The thing about Jackson, he said an hour into this podcast, the thing about Jackson is that he is an unflashy director. He is a very straightforward director. He is a guy who will, and partly this is due to his ongoing relationship with visual effects, whatever the cutting edge standard of visual effects is as he is producing any particular film. He will plant his camera and allow the visual effects to play out to the fullest capacity possible. The cinematography that we see in The Lord of the Rings is unfussy. It is also beautiful, largely thanks to some magnificent performances and the unbelievable landscape of New Zealand, right? Like, there's a lot going on there that is just absolutely breathtaking without moving the camera once. He is not in that way a flashy filmmaker. But there is more flash here, particularly in these heavily animated sequences. Consider, for example, the escape from Goblin Town, the Goblin Town roller coaster. Goblin Town here for me, an absolute first to last disaster. Cannot stand it. Do not like the Goblin King. Really hate the inclusion of the song in the extended edition, which is surprising because, as you know, I'm a very big fan of the songs in general. It just does not work. It's so wild to me that we counterpoint what is for me the least successful animated sequence in the film with what is inarguably, I think, the most successful animated sequence in the film, which is, say it with me now, The Return of Gollum, right? It is Riddles in the Dark. It is, as I was saying earlier, it struck me so much early in the film that we were getting the full Tolkien dialogue. I never expected the Riddle game in full. I thought there's no way that we would get the Riddle game in full. I was worried going into this film that we would just not get the Riddle game from Peter Jackson, that it would be truncated into some kind of action sequence where maybe they would throw a couple of pithy bon mots at each other as they chased each other through goblin tunnels. But it turns out we get the whole thing. The first thing that they shot, I am told, was Martin Freeman and Andy Serkis there in the cave set, which is just, as I say, there's little in this film that you can stick a flag in and say, everyone agrees that this is really good, right? But I think that everyone agrees that the Riddles in the Dark sequence is really good. And I am certainly one of them. I think I'm nearing the end of what I have to say about this film as the first part of a trilogy. Obviously, we're going to have a lot more to talk about in terms of our movement into the second and third films in the weeks to come. But I think that this is probably around about where I'm going to wrap up. That will leave us with this very, very thin schedule, I'm afraid. The next time that we shall gather here together for Shire Reckoning, February 10th for The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, as released in 2013. A little bit less, production story and a little bit more real analysis of the text and the structure of this ongoing story by the time that we get to that conversation. As I say, you can also join me next week for our Stars and Swords discussion of the back half of William Gibson's incredibly influential and foresighted novel, Neuromancer. If you're interested in the not practical origins, but, foundational texts of cyberpunk as a movement, you should absolutely join me next week for a discussion of William Gibson's Neuromancer, and we'll also be deciding our next book for Stars and Swords 2. As always, thank you guys so much for your time. Thank you so much for your patience. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I hope, as I say, that this reduction in capacity here at Next Word will be brief. I didn't even mention that back at the beginning when I was talking about the reduced podcast load that I'm going to have for the next little while. I'm hoping this is going to be like 6 or 8 weeks. I can't promise because the new job requires a great deal of onboarding and I've got a lot to learn is what it comes down to, and a great deal of transformation here in my domestic schedule with my family. But hopefully this is only going to be for a little while, and then we will be back fully on our regular schedule, as I say. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to Shire Reckoning. I hope you are all enjoying the end of whatever wintry weather you are currently experiencing. I know that's probably unlikely for many of you, but I'll tell you, I've had a week of snow on the ground and ice falling from eaves and being unable to go anywhere, and I'm kind of ready for it to be over now, which, as a Scotsman, I thought I would never say, but here we are. Nonetheless, yeah, Chris is saying, I have lots in Michigan. Yeah, you've got a little bit to look forward to, right? Still up there. I used to live in Syracuse in upstate New York, so I'm very, very familiar with the very bitter winters and the feet and feet and feet of snow. I am being bedeviled now by like 8 inches of snow, and that doesn't seem at all fair or reasonable, but here we are nonetheless. That's going to do it for this episode of Shire Reckoning. Thank you all for joining me. I will talk to you all again soon. Until then, please do take care. Good night, all.